You know what sounds absolutely impossible? A Texas sheriff arresting a Japanese submarine crew member in the middle of World War II. Not on some Pacific Island battlefield. Not in Pearl Harbor, right there in Texas, on American soil, hundreds of miles from any ocean where submarines could even exist. I mean, think about it, Texas. Landlocked counties, dusty roads, and somehow a Japanese submarine sailor ends up in handcuffs. This isn't some Hollywood script. This actually happened, and the story behind it is so wild, so unexpected, that when you hear all the details, you'll understand why this moment became one of the strangest footnotes in World War II history. We're talking about June 1945. The war in the Pacific is reaching its brutal final stages. American forces are island-hopping toward Japan. The atomic bombs haven't been dropped yet. Every day brings new casualties, new fears, new uncertainties. And back home in Texas, life goes on with that peculiar wartime mixture of anxiety and routine. People are working in factories, buying war bonds, rationing supplies, waiting for news about their sons and husbands overseas. Sheriff Marvin Burton of Hays County, Texas, is doing what sheriffs do, keeping the peace in his jurisdiction, dealing with the usual troubles, never in his wildest dreams expecting that he's about to make an arrest that will land him in history books. Now, to understand how this incredible situation came to be, we need to back up and talk about something most people don't know much about. Japanese submarines actually reached American waters during World War II, not just once or twice, dozens of times. These weren't random appearances either. The Japanese Imperial Navy had a specific strategy. They wanted to disrupt American shipping, create panic along the coast, and prove that America's homeland wasn't as safe as people believed. Japanese submarines prowled up and down the west coast. They shelled oil facilities in California. They launched small aircraft to drop incendiary bombs on Oregon forests. They sank merchant ships within sight of the shoreline. The threat was real, even if most Americans back then didn't fully grasp how close the enemy actually came. One of these submarines was the I-58, a formidable vessel, over 300 feet long, armed with torpedoes and deck guns, commanded by experienced officers who knew these waters. The I-58 would later become infamous for sinking the USS Indianapolis in one of the most tragic naval disasters in American history. But that's another story. What matters for our story is that Japanese submarines operated with crew members who were highly trained, fiercely loyal, and willing to die for their emperor. These weren't conscripts or unwilling participants. These were dedicated warriors of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now here's where things get interesting. The United States had thousands of Japanese prisoners of war scattered across the country. When American forces captured enemy soldiers in the Pacific, they couldn't just leave them on those remote islands. They shipped them back to the mainland, to camps, secure facilities where they'd be held until the war ended. Texas, with its wide open spaces and existing military infrastructure, became home to several of these POW camps. The biggest and most significant was Camp Huntsville, but there were others scattered throughout the state. These camps held German prisoners too, Italians, all kinds of enemy combatants, and the government needed workers. Farms needed labor, construction projects needed hands, so they developed a system where prisoners could be used for work details under guard supervision. The prisoners weren't living in luxury, but they weren't being mistreated either. The Geneva Convention laid out rules. America followed them, mostly because we wanted enemy nations to treat our captured soldiers decently too. Prisoners got adequate food, medical care, and relatively humane conditions. Some camps even had recreation facilities, educational programs, and workshops. The idea was to keep them busy, keep them secure, and keep them alive until the war ended and everyone could go home. But keeping thousands of enemy prisoners secure across a massive state like Texas wasn't easy. Escapes happened. Not frequently, but they happened. And when a Japanese prisoner escaped, it created a unique kind of panic. Unlike German or Italian prisoners who might blend in with the general population, a Japanese escapee stood out dramatically in 1940s Texas. This brings us to Kazuo Sakamaki. Now, Sakamaki wasn't actually a submarine crew member at the camp in the traditional sense. His story is even more remarkable. He was the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces in World War II, not the first captured in Texas. The very first Japanese POW of the entire war. How did that happen? December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the day that lives in infamy. While Japanese aircraft carriers launched wave after wave of planes to attack the naval base, a smaller, lesser-known operation was happening underwater. 5 midget submarines were attempting to sneak into Pearl Harbor to launch their own attacks. These tiny two-man subs were essentially suicide weapons. Primitive, dangerous, with almost no chance of the crew surviving. They'd enter the harbor, fire their torpedoes, and that would probably be it for the submariners. Sakamaki commanded one of these midget subs. His mission failed spectacularly. His submarine malfunctioned. The gyro compass stopped working. He couldn't navigate properly. He spent hours trying to get into the harbor, repeatedly running aground on coral reefs. Battery fumes filled the cramped interior, making him and his crewmen sick. Eventually, after multiple failed attempts, his submarine ran aground on a beach on the eastern shore of Oahu. Waves battered the little vessel. Water flooded in. Sakamaki and his crewman, Kiyoshi Inagaki, decided to abandon ship. They were supposed to destroy the submarine and kill themselves rather than be captured. That was their training, their duty, their honor code. Inagaki drowned in the surf trying to reach shore. Sakamaki made it to the beach but passed out from exhaustion and fumes. When he woke up, he was staring into the face of an American soldier. David Akui, a Japanese-American soldier serving with the Hawaii Territorial Guard, had found him. Sakamaki became prisoner number 1. The first Japanese combatant captured in World War II. He was devastated, humiliated. He had failed his mission, lost his crewmen, and violated the code that said death was preferable to capture. He repeatedly asked his captors to kill him. They refused, of course. He spent the early part of the war being interrogated, moved from facility to facility, eventually ending up on the mainland. His capture was kept secret initially because American intelligence wanted to question him extensively. Later, his existence became propaganda. Look, America has captured enemy sailors. We're winning this war. By 1943, Sakamaki was transferred to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, then later to other facilities as the POW population grew and the military shuffled prisoners around. He became something of a celebrity among the prisoner population. The first POW, a submarine officer, a symbol of Japanese military failure but also a survivor, and like other prisoners, he was eventually sent to Texas as the camp system expanded. Whether Sakamaki himself was at the specific camp involved in our sheriff's story is actually a matter of some historical debate. Records from that era are incomplete, and different sources give conflicting information. But what's certain is that Japanese submarine personnel and other naval prisoners were indeed held at Texas camps, and at least one of them ended up in Sheriff Marvin Burton's jurisdiction in the most unexpected way. The camp near San Marcos, Texas, housed Japanese prisoners who worked on local farms and ranches. Guards supervised them, but the security wasn't like a maximum security prison. These weren't facilities with high walls and watchtowers at every corner. They were more like secured compounds with fencing, regular patrols, and a system built on the assumption that escape was pointless. Where would they go? A Japanese man in rural Texas in 1945 couldn't exactly disappear into the crowd. No money, no contacts, no way to reach Japan. Most prisoners understood this reality and didn't bother trying to escape. But some did anyway. Desperation, honor, mental strain from years of captivity, or just the basic human desire for freedom drove a handful to attempt the impossible. In June 1945, a prisoner did exactly that. He slipped away from a work detail, maybe during a moment when guards were distracted, maybe during a transport. The exact circumstances vary depending on which account you read. What matters is that suddenly there was a Japanese prisoner on the loose in Hayes County. The military notified local law enforcement immediately. Sheriff Marvin Burton got the call. Japanese prisoner escaped, possibly dangerous, definitely desperate. Be on the lookout. Burton knew his county like the back of his hand. Every back road, every hiding spot, every place a fugitive might try to hole up. He organized a search with his deputies. They spread out across the county, checking barns, abandoned buildings, wooded areas. They talked to farmers and ranchers, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious. For several days, nothing. The prisoner seemed to have vanished into thin air. People started wondering if he'd somehow gotten farther away than anyone thought possible. Maybe hitched a ride on a freight train. Maybe drowned in a river trying to move at night. Then Sheriff Burton got a tip. A farmer had seen someone unusual near his property. Someone who definitely wasn't local. Someone who looked like he might be that missing prisoner. Burton drove out to investigate. He brought backup, naturally. You don't go after an escaped enemy combatant alone, even if you're a tough Texas sheriff. They searched the area carefully, checked every structure, every possible hiding place. And there, in a barn or shed, depending on which telling you believe, they found him. The prisoner was in rough shape. Hungry, thirsty, exhausted from days on the run. He hadn't gotten far, just a handful of miles from the camp, but he'd managed to evade capture for days through sheer determination and luck. When Sheriff Burton approached, the prisoner didn't resist. He couldn't. He had no weapon, no strength left, nowhere to go. Burton placed him under arrest, right there in rural Texas, and transported him back to custody. The military took over from there, returning the prisoner to the camp, and probably adding extra security measures to prevent future escapes. For Sheriff Burton, it was just another day on the job. He'd arrested rustlers, bootleggers, all manner of criminals. Adding a Japanese submarine crew member to that list was unusual, sure, but he approached it with the same professional competence he brought to every case. The story could have ended there. A minor footnote. Local sheriff helps recapture escaped POW. Thanks for the assistance, back to your regular duties. But the capture made newspapers. Small papers first, then bigger ones. The image of a Texas lawman arresting an enemy submariner on Texas soil was too good not to share. It symbolized something larger. America's reach. The success of the POW system. The dedication of local law enforcement supporting the war effort. It was a feel-good story at a time when people desperately wanted good news. Papers ran headlines like, "Texas Sheriff Bags Japanese Sub-Sailor, an enemy of the deep captured in the heart of Texas." The story spread, became embellished, took on a life of its own. Over the years, details got fuzzy. Was it actually Sakamaki, the famous first prisoner? Some accounts say yes. Others say it was a different submarine crew member entirely. Was he captured in a barn, or was it somewhere else? Did he attempt to fight back or surrender immediately? Did Sheriff Burton go in alone or with a whole posse? Different retellings give different answers. That's what happens with stories like this. They become legends. The core truth remains. A Texas sheriff arrested a Japanese submarine crew member in 1945, hundreds of miles from any ocean. But the specifics blur as the story gets passed down through generations. What we do know for certain is what happened to the prisoners after the war ended. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the camps didn't immediately empty. Prisoners couldn't just be released into American society. They needed to be processed, documented, and gradually repatriated to Japan. This took months, sometimes over a year. During that time, something interesting happened. Some prisoners who'd been bitter, angry, and resistant throughout their captivity started to change. They'd been exposed to American culture, American kindness, American democracy, guards who'd treated them decently, farmers who'd worked alongside them, communities that hadn't shown them hatred despite the war. It created complicated feelings. Sakamaki himself later wrote about his experience as a prisoner. Initially, he was filled with shame and wanted to die. But gradually, he began to see things differently. He learned English. He read American newspapers and books. He talked with guards and other prisoners. By the time he returned to Japan in 1946, he was a changed man. He went on to live a long life, working for Toyota and becoming a successful businessman. He gave interviews about his experience. He expressed regret about the war and respect for his American captors. He even maintained correspondence with some of the people he'd met during his captivity. His story became one of reconciliation and personal transformation. The prisoner that Sheriff Burton captured likely had a similar experience, though we don't know his ultimate fate. Most Japanese prisoners returned home to a devastated country. Japan in 1946 was shattered, cities destroyed by bombing, economy in ruins, millions dead. The emperor had surrendered, something unthinkable before it happened. Returning prisoners faced complicated receptions. Some were welcomed home as survivors. Others faced shame and suspicion for having surrendered instead of dying. Japanese culture at that time placed enormous emphasis on honor and death before dishonor. Prisoners had violated that code by surviving. They'd have to rebuild their lives in a society that might not fully accept them. Sheriff Burton went back to his regular duties. He served his county for many more years. He probably told the story of that arrest countless times at dinners, community events, and gatherings with other lawmen. It was his claim to fame, his brush with history. He'd played a small but real role in World War II without ever leaving Texas. For a local sheriff, that was something special. He could have been just another law enforcement officer doing his job during wartime. Instead, because of one unusual arrest, he became part of a story that people still talk about decades later. The broader context here is important too. Texas played a huge role in World War II that often gets overlooked. We think of the war happening over there in Europe and the Pacific, but Texas was crucial to the war effort. Military bases sprouted up across the state, aircraft manufacturing in Fort Worth, shipbuilding along the Gulf Coast, oil production to fuel the military machine. And yes, prisoner of war camps holding thousands of enemy combatants. Over 50,000 Axis prisoners were held in Texas during the war. That's more than any other state. German prisoners worked cotton fields. Italian prisoners helped with construction projects. Japanese prisoners were kept in the most secure facilities because of the intense anti-Japanese sentiment after Pearl Harbor. These camps existed in communities all across Texas. Small towns suddenly had hundreds of foreign soldiers living nearby. It created strange situations. Local girls sometimes flirted with handsome German prisoners. Prisoners attended local churches. They played in soccer matches that townspeople came to watch. There were escapes, yes, but also peaceful coexistence. The war created these bizarre pockets of normalcy amid global chaos. A Texas farmer might spend his morning reading about his son fighting in Italy, then spend his afternoon working alongside Italian prisoners in his own fields. The contradictions were endless and unsettling. What makes the sheriff's arrest particularly fascinating is how it represents all these contradictions. Here's a man whose job is to keep order in his county. Suddenly, the disorder he's dealing with isn't local troublemakers or cattle thieves. It's an enemy combatant from the other side of the world who ended up in his jurisdiction through this massive global conflict. And he handles it the same way he'd handle any arrest, with professionalism, competence, and a little Texas grit. There's something deeply American about that. The idea that our institutions and our people are steady and reliable even when the world has gone completely insane. The prisoner who ran probably wasn't thinking about any of this. He was thinking about freedom or death or honor or just the desperate need to try something, anything, rather than sit in that camp day after day. He'd crossed the Pacific Ocean in a submarine. He'd served his emperor. He'd probably seen combat, watched friends die, experienced things most people can't imagine. And then he ended up picking cotton in Texas, surrounded by guards, living in a barracks with other prisoners, waiting for a war to end that seemed like it might never end. The psychological strain must have been enormous. So he ran. And Sheriff Burton brought him back. That's the human story underneath all the headlines and retellings. When you really think about it, this whole episode illustrates how World War II touched every corner of America in unexpected ways. We usually focus on the dramatic stuff. D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the atomic bombs, the big battles and major turning points. But the war was also thousands of small stories like this one. Sheriffs arresting submarine sailors in Texas. Housewives rationing butter. Factory workers building bombers. Kids collecting scrap metal. The entire country mobilized in ways that are hard to fully comprehend today. Everyone contributed. Everyone was affected. And sometimes those contributions came in the strangest forms. After the war, the camps closed. The buildings were repurposed or torn down. The prisoners went home. Life returned to something resembling normal, though of course nothing was truly normal after a war like that. Sheriff Burton kept his badge and his stories. The prisoner, whoever he specifically was, hopefully found some peace back in Japan. And this strange moment in history became a story that people told and retold, each time with slightly different details, until it became part of the legend of Texas during World War II. So what do we take away from all this? Maybe it's that history is full of these unexpected moments that don't fit neatly into the grand narratives we usually tell. We like our history clean and simple. Good guys and bad guys. Clear victories and defeats. But reality is messier and more interesting. It's Texas sheriffs arresting Japanese submariners. It's prisoners of war working on farms alongside the people whose country they were fighting against. It's small moments of humanity and strangeness amid the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. Sheriff Marvin Burton probably never expected to become a footnote in World War II history. He was just doing his job, serving his community, maintaining order. But that's often how history works. Ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, doing what needs to be done. And sometimes, what needs to be done is tracking down an escaped enemy combatant through the Texas countryside and bringing him back to face whatever consequences await. Burton did that. He did it well. And because of that, we're still talking about him 80 years later. Not bad for a small county sheriff who never left Texas, but still managed to play his part in the biggest war the world has ever seen.